Good to be with you, my friends. We'll share the screen and jump right into one of the more interesting, or actually, I feel like all of Genesis is interesting because they all are stories that we use lots, but we don't always know. So almost all of them have some interest for me anyway. All right, so last week we had the covenant, the second covenant with God, between God and Avram. Avram becomes Avraham, or Abram becomes Abraham, and is circumcised at the ripe old age of 99, along with his whole household. Sarai becomes Sarah, becomes princess. And then finally, beneath the oaks of Mamre, the three angels share that Isaac is coming, right? Isaac, the son of laughter, is on his way. So it's a pretty big reading. This week is actually no less. This week we have Sodom and Gomorrah. So we've got a whole, which is interestingly, people never connect them, but it's the continuation of the story. Last week you have those three messengers who show up. Now they leave Avraham and they go to see his nephew Lot. And so it's literally, this is the second half. So you have this promise of life that God gives to Avraham, and then you have this judgment that is coming right on its tails. So without further ado, we'll just jump in and start. Chapter 18, verses 16, moving on. The men arose from there, that is the three messengers, and looked down upon the face of Sodom. And Avraham went with them to escort them. Now the Lord had said to himself, "Shall I cover up from Avraham what I am about to do?" For Avraham has become a great and mighty in number. And all the nations of the earth will find blessing through him. Indeed, I have known him in order that he may charge his sons and his household after him. They shall keep the way of the Lord, to do what is right and just, in order that the Lord may bring upon Avraham what he spoke concerning him. So again, that's sort of all an internal little monologue that God has with himself here that we get to listen in on. Then it turns and the Lord said, "The outcry in Sodom and Gomorrah, how great it is, and their sin, how exceedingly heavy it weighs. Now let me go down and see if they have done according to its cry that has come to me, destruction. And if not, I wish to know." The men turned from there and went towards Sodom. And Avraham stood still in the presence of the Lord. Oh, blessings. Avraham came close and said, "Will you really sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? Perhaps there are 50 innocent within the city. Will you really sweep it away? Will you not bear with the place because of the 50 innocent that are in its midst? Heaven forbid for you to do a thing like this, to deal death to the innocent along with the guilty, that it should come about. Like the innocent, like the guilty, heaven forbid for you. The judge of all the earth, will he not do what is just?" The Lord said, "If I find in Sodom 50 innocent within the city, I will bear with the whole place for their sake." Avraham spoke up and said, "Now pray, I have ventured to speak to my Lord, and I am but earth and ashes. Perhaps of the 50 innocent, 5 will be lacking. Will you bring ruin upon the whole city because of the 5? He said, "I will not bring ruin if I find there 45. But he continued to speak to him and said, "Perhaps there will be found there only 40. He said, "I will not do it for the sake of the 40. But he said, "Pray, let not my Lord be upset that I speak further. Perhaps there would be found only 30. He said, "I will not do it if there are 30, if I find there 30. But he said, "Now pray, I have ventured to speak to my Lord. Perhaps there will be found there only 20. He said, "I will not bring ruin for the sake of the 20. But he said, "Pray, let my Lord not be upset that I speak further just this one time. Perhaps there will be found there only 10. He said, "I will not bring ruin for the sake of the 10. The Lord went as soon as he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. All right. Now we got good old Sodom and Gomorrah.
This just got some airtime in the lectionary, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. It did.
Sounds very familiar, like something I read at the 6 o'clock, in fact.
Yes. Good old Sodom and Gomorrah. So despite our conversation last week about the three messengers being the Trinity, right, which is the sort of Christian view, the three go to Sodom while the Lord speaks and bargains with Avraham. So Stefan had a back PT today, but he'd be happy to know that really the story, if you're paying attention to it, jumps us straight out of that. So the Lord and the three are different entities, or at least seem to be. So some notes on negotiating. All right. So what we have next is this extended negotiation between Abraham and the Lord. This is not a rhetorical question. How do you go into a negotiation? For any of you business folks, any of you folks who have worked in any of these situations, or with just when you go and buy a purse, how do you go into a negotiation? What are some of the things you need to have? It's not a trick question. Oh my goodness. All right. You need to have an idea of what you want, right? On the most basic of elements, you need to know what you want and need from the other person, right? And to be clear about that. So when we went this summer to Israel, I had heard this from multiple people that if you were walking in Jerusalem, there are literally stalls everywhere of people trying to sell a variety of things. And what you have to be ready for is to negotiate. And when you negotiate, if you want to buy, say, a t-shirt, which my son Mose wanted a shirt that had the name Moses on it. He thought that was great because there are not a lot of Moses shirts around Atlanta. It's to look at that shirt and to go in your head before you even start the conversation, what is the most I'm willing to pay for a t-shirt that says Moses on it, right? Am I going to pay $50? No, I'm not paying $50 for a t-shirt with Moses on it. I'll pay up to $15, right? Or what then it's only once you have this idea of what your number is that you can start the negotiation. If you don't, then you end up paying $50 for the t-shirt, right? Because they're always going to start at a level that they go, oh, I want $50 for that shirt or whatever. And you'll go, no, how about 20, right? How about 10? Like you go back and forth in a negotiation and you have to know what your threshold is, right?
Did
What do
they
you
have
want?
a sign? Did they have a sign of what the
Nope.
price was? They don't tell you what they're going to ask for it.
There is not a price on anything that I saw in Jerusalem.
Okay. Not
It's
like
always
our stores here. Yeah.
no. It's just laid out on the table, and you just have conversations. And so, like this happened for all of us when we were there, right? So, let's say you wanted a T-shirt, you go back and forth, and one guy said something to me at one point from when we were buying Moses' shirt. I want $25 or whatever it was for the shirt, and I said, "Oh, it seems awful high." I didn't even give an answer to that was a different negotiation tactic. It's like, it sounds really high. And he goes, well, what about 22? And I said, oh, I don't know, my friend. And he's like, well, fine. What number do you want? And I said, how about $10? And he goes, no, I will not do $10. How about $15? I said, I can do $15. And so we were fine, right? But it was that sort of back and forth process to get you to what you wanted. And in some cases, there were other things where you would try to negotiate and they didn't want to go below a certain price and you're not willing to pay, so you don't buy anything. You say, well, thanks anyway. And you both move on and there's no one's upset. That's just how negotiation works, right?
So that's just the way they do it.
That's everything. Everything in Israel, anywhere you went that way for the most part. Occasionally there would be sort of a fixed price, but most of the time it was a negotiation for just about anything. And then there'd be other fascinating things like Trey, one of our seminarians, was going to had a whole conversation with a guy, had negotiated his price for something, and he opened his wallet, and in his wallet he had someone had given him a Palestinian flag, like a little card with a Palestinian flag on it. And the guy goes, wait a second, why do you have that? And he goes, well, because we were in Ramallah, we were at that church that we worshiped in Ramallah, at St. Andrews, and we were praying there with the Palestinians for the peace of Israel and for the peace of Palestine. And the guy was Palestinian, and he goes, okay, take $10 off, like just instantly, right? Because it was sort of like, oh, well, if you're on our side, we'll give you another deal, right? So it's just sort of how that world works, right? It's absolutely, they've got their number. I mean, there's nothing to feel bad about when you negotiate, because they know what they paid for that t-shirt or those socks or that cross,
Mhm.
your job is just to say, this is what I'm willing to pay for those things. And if you can find a match, then you find a match, right?
Interesting.
It's weird because that's not how, in America, we would never go to Macy's and say, I like those pants. Can I give you $5 for them?
Yeah, no.
They go, are you insane? It's $75 pants. And you're like, well,
Yeah.
I'll pay you $5 for them. You're like, you're going to pay me 75 or nothing. And you're like, well, then I'm nothing,
Mhm.
But totally everything there and
Mm.
most of that world. I mean, I've heard that if you go into Marrakesh if you go into Istanbul, all of those are places where negotiating is part of just the regular way of life. It's not anything to look down on or have a problem with. It's just how you get business done.
Yeah. And here they're negotiating with God.
And
So,
here it's negotiating with God. So we shouldn't be
for
surprised.
the
It's
numbers
definitely sort of in character, right?
for that, for that part of the world particularly.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Hmm.
but you try, and in negotiation, good negotiator will tell you there's two things you have to do. You have to have an idea of what you want and what you need from the other. And then you have to try and find that level where you both parties can win, right? But the best negotiators will also say the best negotiator takes the time to listen to and get to know the person you're negotiating with, right? So Trey didn't necessarily do it on purpose, but unintentionally he made a connection to the guy he was negotiating with because he had that flag, that Palestinian flag,
Mhm.
and it made that connection. And so he got a better deal because they felt like they had a common ground. Well, if you don't feel like you have a common ground, if he hadn't had that, he wouldn't have gotten the discount or wouldn't have gotten that whatever that additional number was, because it would have been like, well, he's just another random guy buying that cross from me, right? It's a different
Right.
way. So the
Interesting.
best negotiation is always one where you can find, what you want, you can find a place where it's a win-win situation, but even more where there's a relationship, where there's
Mhm.
some deeper way of knowing each other and feeling like, oh, I trust the person I'm working with. I like this guy. I like this woman. What can they do? How can we work together? Because now I want you to win too, because I like you as a person, not just we're on the opposite sides of the negotiation,
Right. Yeah. Right. There's a
right?
time there. Yeah.
And it seems silly to talk about it here, but this is 100% what happens in this story, right? If we're listening, Avraham doesn't just say, hey, God, what about 20 people? 20 people work? It's much more, God, you are the God of, I mean, he sort of butters him up to a certain degree and talks about you're a just God. Why would you kill the unjust, the innocent with the wicked? Like, what about 10 of them? How many, like he sort of goes back and forth in a way that knows God and is familiar with God, but also he has a clear idea of what he wants, right?
Yeah.
And what does Abraham want? He's clearly trying to get God down to a number he prefers. And we're not sure if that number is 10 or not, but that's the number God's willing to go down to, right? Like it sort of gets to this point with 10 and then just God leaves. God goes, that's good. 10's all I'm giving you, right? If there's 9 people, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But if there's 10, that averts the crisis, right? Here's my question to all of you. Why do you think the number is 10 for Abraham? If you're thinking like Abraham, God's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. How can I prevent? He seems to want to prevent it, or at least prevent this injustice. Why the number 10?
The only thing I can think of is 10 Commandments.
10 Commandments, sure. They come a little later, but yeah. All right, so why 10? I would argue that he believes that Lot and his family would be the 10 people that would save Sodom. Right? Lot and his wife, there's 2. We learn later that they have 2 daughters and 2 husbands, right? So there's 6. Not clear if if he has grandchildren or not, where all that kind of falls in, but I'm pretty sure he sort of said, look, if I can get down to 10, surely there's 4 other righteous people than just Lot and his family, right? Like that seems to be, I would argue that Avraham, in the best of negotiations, is trying to save Sodom and Gomorrah. He's trying to get God down to a number that he thinks is possible. And I think he truly probably believed that there were at least 10 people in Sodom and Gomorrah that were worth anything, right? That between Lot and literally Abraham's nephew and his family, he was sort of going, well, there's got to be 6 to 10 people there just in their family, right? They've got slaves and groups of people that they have all over the place. He tries, right? And he gets God down to that number, which is interesting. But what I love particularly is that God's willing to negotiate and engage. And yes, Abraham appeals to God's vanity, his mercy, his goodwill. But I think it says something about God, that God is willing to negotiate and listen. And I do think sometimes in our Christian perspective, we've been doing a great class that Craig's been in with Temple Sinai next door. I think this is one of those that Jews would willingly say that they believe they negotiate and talk to God in this way. While I think Christians tend to approach it with Jesus's "Your will be done, God," and we sort of go passive very quickly. Right? It's a difference in approach in how we listen to God. If we believe Abraham is the leader of our faith in the ways that Jews do, then, well, Abraham bargained with God, I'll bargain with God, right? Like I'll negotiate with him. While on our side, we go, well, Jesus had a chance to bargain away or get out of the cross, but instead he just sort of goes, "Your will be done." And he begs for it and he asks, but there's this sort of not passivity completely, but certainly a willingness to relent to God's will over the individual will. All that to say, I would argue it's worthwhile to, in our prayers, to not be ashamed of negotiating for what we want or need from God. Doesn't mean we're going to get it.
Right.
But I would argue that that's the best prayer, is when we say, I really need this, God, or I really hope for this. And if you're a just God, help me understand this, right? I mean, I think that is a huge part of what Abraham and this conversation is about. Not necessarily about, I mean, at the end of the day, Abraham does not save Sodom and Gomorrah either, right?
Right.
I mean, if you're talking about in a pure negotiation stance, Abraham gets to a number he thinks is going to work. It doesn't work. It gets destroyed. He fails on some level, certainly fails in saving Sodom and Gomorrah. But he succeeds in being in relationship with God. He succeeds in negotiating with God. He succeeds in being faithful and helping to understand God's intent, right? And judgment.
Well, I'm going to throw something in there that is totally off of this, but it has to do with Abraham. We started watching the Jamestown series, which is interesting. And we watched several of those. And we got to this point where, like, this leader, I didn't know they had slaves in Jamestown, but they did bring slaves into Jamestown.
Almost from the start, yeah.
And then when there's all these really religious people who are, some people are arguing that we should not have slaves, and the man who is always puts him up to be so religious, and he says there is nothing wrong with us having slaves. After all, Abraham had slaves in the Bible, and I was like, oh my goodness. And
yep.
Because, he said Abraham had slaves. There's nothing wrong with us having slaves in Jamestown. And of course, I was clueless and didn't even know until we were in this study that Abraham had slaves. So,
right.
But anyway, this man throws that out there. Abraham had slaves, so there's nothing wrong with us having slaves. So,
right.
There you go. He tied it in.
Well, but it's also, I'd say, if we're going to sort of engage with this negotiation and conversation that Abraham has with God, there's lots of things in the Bible that don't make sense. And a big part of what Abraham does is apply sort of this idea of like, wait, is it really fair that you kill the innocent with the guilty? Right. And I would say that in many ways, being faithful to Abraham, even though, yes, he had slaves, would also be to say, wait a second, if you're the God and all of these are your children, why should some be owned by another, right? Like those same questions should have been part of Abraham's conversation as well, but he did not. But it's also where I think people catastrophically misunderstand the Bible. And I use that word intentionally, catastrophically misunderstand the Bible as being static,
Mhm. Right.
right? As it being like this, well, it's always said the same thing and it's always meant the same thing. And you're like, well, no, clearly Abraham had slaves and that was okay. But by the time you get to the New Testament, they're having some conversations about like, well, is it right? Like it's the shortest letter in the whole New Testament, but Philemon is basically going, well, I have a slave, but he ran away to me, and maybe we can figure out how to make this a better deal. And they're trying to figure out really what a little bit of, in just that brief letter,
Mhm.
what is slavery about? And does this fit? And then Paul goes on to say, like, there is no slave or free, right? He starts to talk about how all this is changing
Right.
over and over again in the Bible. If you're really listening, there's something that can be taught in one section, and then, oh, wait, maybe this means something different than we think down the
Right.
road.
I just thought it was interesting that when they're having the argument about whether or not they're going to have slaves in Jamestown, that was the thing they said, well, Abraham did it in the Bible, so it's okay.
Yep. Yeah.
Oh,
And they
no.
probably accepted that. They probably were like, well, yeah, hard to argue that.
Yeah, they did accept, a lot of them did accept it, but didn't make it right.
No.
Anyway, it just, because we'd had that conversation about being disturbed about Abraham and the slaves, I thought, oh my gosh, here it is.
Well, the interesting thing is I find it fascinating that we were disturbed about Abraham having slaves, but we seem to be okay with him having a wife and a mistress. Right? Like no one made too many comments about Hagar. All the patriarchs are sort of like, oh, they got their wives, and then they've got these whole collection of additional women that they've got as well. And it's like, that polygamy seems to get slipped through there too sometimes. Any other thoughts on dealing or negotiating with God on this sort of section? Because then it goes into, next we go into the actual story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
The word that comes to mind for me during this is fear. And fear of the Lord.
Right.
And the way we have morphed that word in recent centuries. And how I think at one time it meant respect, it meant awe. It didn't mean be terrified of.
Right. Well, I think fear of the Lord, like, had both connotations, right? I think if you really talk about some of what Israel says when they say fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, it is that respect and it's that awe. And I do think it's always twinged with a little bit, not of like God's going to kill me today kind of fear, but if with that word he can create the heavens and the earth, then there is a power there that has to be respected, right? There's a authority and a knowledge and all of that has to be respected and feared.
I think what I've always done with this story in my mind is I've imagined, what if the conversation kept going, and what if he went down to 5, and what if he went down to 2, and what if he went down to 1?
Right.
And the meaning I take from this is that even if he had gotten down to 1, God would have said, I will save them for the 1. I mean, that's I think maybe that's the comforting place I go with this.
Sure.
When I'm chewing on the scripture.
Yeah. Well, and the other side that I think is comforting in this scripture, but some people get anxious about it, is what we've talked about before. God is clearly not omniscient in this text, right? Like this text starts with God saying, man, there have been people calling out, there's a lot of problems down in Sodom and Gomorrah. More or less, I've heard their prayers, right? I've heard the cries of all these people in Sodom and Gomorrah. Things seem to be bad down there. I need to go find out what's going on. But this is not God negotiating in a way that is disingenuous, right? Like God sort of gets into this thing and goes, okay, if there's 10 people, I believe if there had been 10 people, God would not have destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And I don't think the way that we understand God in this text is someone who is omniscient and just holding, sort of crossing his fingers behind his back.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. I mean, I think it is God saying, yeah, if there's 10 seems like, yeah, I'll spare the city if there's 10 people, no problem. But then he gets down there and realizes there's not 10 people, there's not even 5 people that are faithful. And so then he's sort of open to do what God decides to do, right? To pronounce that judgment. But I do think that's for me, that's the other part of it that is hopeful and faithful, is this is a God who doesn't come down and say, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because I already know there's not a soul in that city worth anything. You know, he doesn't come down with that judgment already. It's, I come down to see and to know what's going on and make sure that I have it right, versus what somebody else said.
Hmm.
All right, so we'll jump in to the next, which is a good portion of the next chapter. The 2 messengers came to Sodom at sunset as Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he arose to meet them and bowed low, brow to the ground, and said, Now, pray, my lords, pray turn aside to your servant's house, spend the night, wash your feet. Starting early, you may go on your way. They said, No, rather we'll spend the night in the square. But he, Lot, pressed them exceedingly hard, so they turned into him and came into his house. And he made them a meal with drink and baked flat cakes, and they ate. They had not yet laid down when the men of the city, the men of Sodom, encircled the house from young lad to old man, all the people, even from the outskirts. They called out to Lot and said to him, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us. We want to know them. Lot went out to them to the entrance, shutting the door behind him, and said, Pray, brothers, do not be so wicked. Now pray, I have 2 daughters who have never known a man. Pray, let me bring them out to you, and you may deal with them however seems good in your eyes. Only to these men do nothing, for they have, after all, come under the shadow of my roof beam. But they said, Step aside, and said, This one came to sojourn and wants to play the judge. Now we will do worse to you than to them. And they pressed exceedingly hard against the man, against Lot, and stepped closer to break down the door. But the men, the messengers, put out their hand and brought Lot into the house and shut the door. And the men who were at the entrance to the house, they struck with dazzling light all men, great and small, so they were unable to find the entrance. Cool. All right. So we have the same messengers, and actually it's 2. There are now 2 messengers go to Sodom and receive hospitality from Lot. And Lot appears to know that their presence could be a problem in the city and demands that he protects them, right? Like they basically say, we want to go sleep in the open square, which evidently was a semi-common practice in those days, that you could do something like that. But Lot basically goes, no, you won't make it out there. You got to come to my house. Let me protect you, right? And so this is a hospitality that demands a lot more from Lot than from Abraham. And we should see those 2 stories connected. That is, hospitality, the way it's supposed to work, is what Abraham does, which is literally, let's kill the fatted calf, let's care for these people, let's wash their feet, let's feed them, let's give them shelter in the middle of the hot sunny day, let's respect them and honor them, right? Which then shows the evil of Sodom, which is to violate that hospitality in nearly every way, shape, or form, a desire to injure the men, a desire to prosecute them, a desire to even injure Lot, right? We're supposed to see these as very different ways, one very godlike, one very much evil. All right. So next we have to talk about the hard part that everybody, because it's been laid on this passage so much. All the men, or the men of all the ages in the city, come to, quote, know the messengers, right? To know them. And know is that word that is used, yada, is one that can have a meaning of have sexual relations with, right? Like Adam knew his wife Eve and they had children. Abraham knew his wife Sarah and they had Isaac. And historically, then, this is where the term sodomy comes from, with the understanding that the men hope to rape or sexually know the messengers, right? That is how this verse has been interpreted. It's how it's been explained. It's how it's been taught. That said, While that's the traditional interpretation, it's not exactly what the text says. It does say that they want to know the messengers in some way, shape, or form. And then we have this horrible sequence. The part that we're so busy talking about the messengers and homosexuality, we seem to ignore the fact that Lot literally offers his daughters to be raped by the crowd. It's horrible. You're like,
that was horrible. He said they had never known a man, and then he just like is
here, you
offering.
can take my girls. I'll be fine. Like, what?
What is wrong with him?
I know. No, and it just gets skated over because basically they turn him down so he doesn't have to worry about it. But it is a horrible sequence unto itself.
That was terrible.
So Brueggemann then notes that, quote, the turbulent mood of the narrative suggests gang rape rather than a private act of either sodomy or any specific homosexual act. Right? If you read it, it just says we want to know them, which the whole town is basically like, send out these two guys so we can kill them, more or less, right? So we can brutalize them, we can beat them, we can violate them, we can injure them. It's certainly not about any dedicated relational act between two men, right? Like, oh, here's two men in a mutual relationship who want to have a sexual relationship. It has nothing to do with that. Nothing. It is 100% this idea of corporate community violence on a visitor. That's what's literally recorded. People end up going to homosexuality and to sodomy, but it's much more this very like just horrible. The whole town shows up to injure these men, these visitors, right? But it does though give, and I agree with Brueggemann on this, it gives a clear idea that Sodom is a city which has the, quote, general disorder of a society organized against God, right? Whatever the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is, what it clearly is they don't care at all about the rules of God. That is, that you care for the visitor and you care for the outsider and you care for the other, and you or just basic hospitality, right? Which hospitality, I'd always heard this before we went to Israel, but it is 1,000% true. They could not be a more hospitable community. And that's whether we were talking to Jews, Muslims, or Christians, everyone in that region had a deep, deep understanding of hospitality, and that you welcome people in and not just sort of go, oh, glad you're in my house. It's, would you like to eat something? Would you like this? Would you like, it's all like anything is yours almost in this process of just welcoming you in, and being friendly and connected, which is why then Sodom and Gomorrah stand against that, which I think it is fair to say it is not so much about sexuality as it is about the violation of the norms of any community, right? Of violating this norm of, you don't rape people who are visitors to your house. You don't violate hospitality, right? Like there's a certain requirement that we all have to be kind to the stranger and to the other. Even if it's just vaguely taught to us, it's still, these are not things you do. You don't have to have all 613 laws of Moses to say there's something wrong with the men of Sodom, right? To say that this is an action that makes sense to them, that they're just going to try and knock down the door and take someone, is patently crazy, right? To take it a step further, while people can disagree about the sin of Sodom, that is, lots of people immediately have to say, oh, it's this, that, and the other. The Bible is clear that it's not homosexuality. Why? Because it gets mentioned in 3 other locations along with this. And at no point in this section does it say, and God condemned them for being gay or homosexual or for men and knowing men or any of those kinds of things. There's not either a euphemism or a declaration that homosexuality is at fault. Instead, what is listed as, there's a general cry from the people, right, is what we hear from God, that there's all kinds of problems happening. Isaiah says it's injustice. Jeremiah says it's irresponsible acts, that is, evil actions. And Ezekiel says pride and indifference to the needy is the issue. But if you listen, none of those say it's because they're gay. What it says is it's because they have violated the rules of God, right? They have perpetrated injustice by injuring people who are innocent in the process. Or to say it differently, using the text we just read, God and Abraham had a conversation and say, hey, is there anybody who is just an innocent person? Well, we can say without a doubt that if all of the men showed up, there's not an innocent man in the city, right? They're all horribly messed up folk. Again, Genesis notes that the God just says there's a cry against the city. There's all so much wrong that people are crying out about it, right? So let me pause there, because this is the part that it's been used for a lot of violence and negativity towards our gay sisters and brothers, and quite unfairly, I would argue, because it's not what the story's about. It's the part that people have decided to make it about, but it's not. Again, neither within the text itself nor within the width and breadth of the Old Testament is this actually about sex. It's about violating the innocent. It's about refusing hospitality and doing evil to people who do not deserve it.
Bill, in this case, is the problem with the people or the problem with the messengers who come, the three messengers, or why would there be a problem with the three messengers? Or they just happen to be innocent people that were caught up with the bad guys of Sodom?
Yeah, I think it's the latter, Roy. I think it's just that sort of, no, the messengers are not inherently evil or have any problem at all. They're there to execute God's judgment, to sort of help investigate, I think, what's going on in Sodom. Like, again, God said, I want to see what's happening. God sends in the messengers and go, hey, find out what's happening down there. And they're innocent of anything other than just showing up, being a visitor in a city. And I think any of us would say, well, if there's a city that decides to kill anybody who visits it or to beat them or rape them, then we'd all say, well, that's a pretty bad place. Don't go there. Right.
Right.
I think it's that binary a conversation.
Okay.
So again, this is one that I think it's important for us to take apart and spend a little bit of time on, just because it has been used irresponsibly in a lot of ways, in a lot of preaching and teaching, because it's not about that. We can have conversations about what the Bible does or doesn't say about homosexuality and some other points, but it's just not, it's not here. It's not here in any way that's, God could at any point have said, I am going to blow the city up because they're all gay or because they're homosexual, but that's not what is stated, right? All this rest of this.
Well, and Lot's got some major issues to just offer his virgin daughters up to
Yes.
whoever.
Yeah, Lot does not come across as a great cat in
I
this
mean,
at
I'm
all.
like, what in the world is this? Why would you do that?
Yeah. It's all messed up.
Not Sodom and Gomorrah was not a place anybody needed to go. Need to get
Yeah.
out of there. Oh,
I wonder why Lot was picked as the one who would be the host of the messengers.
yeah.
Probably just because, again, he's the nephew of Abraham and is sort of connected to the person. Like here's the nephew of the promised, or the covenanted leader, and so he's the most likely to act well. But yeah, it's not clear exactly why, but probably that. All right, so here's the balance of the story. The men said to Lot, whom else have you have here? A son-in-law, sons, daughters? Bring anyone whom you have in the city out of the place. For we are about to bring ruin on this place, for how great is their outcry before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to bring it to ruin. So Lot went out to speak to his sons-in-law, those who had taken his daughters in marriage, and said, up, out of this place, for the Lord is about to bring ruin on the city. But in the eyes of his sons-in-law, he was like one who jests. Now when the dawn came up, the messengers pushed Lot on, saying, up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the iniquity of the city. So poor Abraham, again, he was hoping for 10 faithful souls. He had at least 6, or at least he thought, but the sons-in-laws don't believe Lot that anything's going to happen, don't seem to be such great guys. And then so it's Lot and his daughters and his wife, right? So there's 4 that might be seen as people, well, certainly the ones that the messengers attempt to save or give warning to, right? So when Lot lingered, the men seized his hand, his wife's hand of his 2 daughters, because the Lord's pity was upon him. Bringing him out, they left him outside the city. It was when they had brought him outside that one of them said, "Escape for your life. Do not gaze behind you. You do not stand still anywhere in the plain, till the hill country. Escape, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "No, pray, my lord. Now pray, your servant has found favor in your sight, in your eyes. You have shown great faithfulness in how you have dealt with me, keeping me alive. But I am not able to escape to the hill country, lest the wickedness cling to me and I die. Now pray, that town is near enough to flee to, and it is so tiny. Pray, let me escape there. Is it not tiny? And stay alive." And he said to him, "Here then, I lift up your face in this matter as well, by not overturning this town of which you speak. Make haste, escape there, for I am not able to do anything until you come there." Therefore the name of the town was called Zoar, tiny. Now the sun was going out over the earth as Lot came to Zoar. But the Lord rained down brimstone and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah, coming from the Lord from the heavens. He overturned those cities and all the plain, all those settled in the cities and the vegetation of the soil. Now his wife gazed behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Avraham started early in the morning to the place where he had stood in the Lord's presence. And he looked down upon the face of Sodom and Gomorrah and saw, and upon the whole face of the plain country, and saw. Here the dense smoke of the land went up with the dense smoke of a furnace. So here's the actual destruction, but it's sort of a fascinating thing. We learn again, Lot didn't count, Abraham did not count particularly well. He's hoping that there were at least 6 folks, and that was Lot, his wife, their daughters-in-law, and sons-in-law. Maybe he guessed there were 4 more, but sadly, we know that the sons-in-law, they weren't faithful. They stayed in Sodom and were destroyed. Even Lot's wife looks back in longing. So the ultimate answer, sort of your point, Craig, if to get the number down right, it would have had to have been 1 or 2 or 3. It would have had to have been Abraham's desire, right? If there's 3 people, are there 3 people in Sodom? Would you not destroy it? Okay, I won't destroy it. Well, then it wouldn't have got destroyed, right? You would have had those 3. But in many ways, Abraham does get his answer, which is, well, they do escape, right? The faithful are not destroyed with the unfaithful. The innocent are not destroyed with the wicked. So many scholars believe that there was a salt pillar at the Dead Sea, and it was called Lot's wife. It's referenced, I guess, one other point in the Bible. And so that may not be, this is sort of those tales that you have sort of the Old West, where they talk about how the Grand Canyon was formed because Babe the Blue Ox and Paul Bunyan were playing and fighting and dug a big hole or something like that. You know, it's this sort of like mythological ways to explain famous sites. And so there's a conversation that a lot of people think that's sort of what happened with the salt pillar, right? There was some sort of pillar that maybe looked vaguely like a woman or like a person, and it was called Lot's wife, and it was described as this sort of moment when Lot's wife looked back and was turned into salt, but probably more, geological in nature. But all that said, Brueggemann does see Abraham's bargain as a clear indictment of Sodom and Gomorrah, but not the way you think. Basically, what he sees it as is Abraham's bargaining is the indictment of the explanations that we all make about when bad things happen, right? So he uses some technical terms here, but he says that Abraham's bargaining is a charismatic critique of the popular religious conviction which is dominant in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and perhaps written in direct response to it. What does that mean? All right, here's what we're talking about. Said differently, Avraham brings up a tough theological issue. And the Bible after this point is never the same. That is, we all inherently ask when there's a natural disaster, was everyone deserving of the earthquake or the tornado or the fire or the war or destruction that happens? But it all comes from Abraham, right? Asking that same question here, like, well, okay, it was destroyed with fire and brimstone, likely some degree of a volcanic destruction, but was everyone there really deserving of it? And that comes from Abraham's conversation here. Surely they're faithful people that did not deserve the destruction, right? When there's a tsunami in Asia, when there's an earthquake here in the States or anywhere, right? We tend to go, oh, well, poor innocent people, and try to separate out what used to be the argument, which the argument always was and still is in some parts. Well, you know why that happened in Florida? It's because of all those terrible people down in Florida, right? None of those people are worth anything anyway. Brueggemann, I think, is right to say that this is a huge charismatic, that is a key shift for the faith, because suddenly after this point, we start to ask the questions that Abraham asked first, which really is, wait a second, are we killing the innocent with the guilty? Maybe this isn't as open and shut as we thought. Maybe there's more going on than we know, right? Or sometimes the world is unfair, and that has nothing to do with judgment as well, right? Sometimes the earthquake is an earthquake, the volcano is a volcano, and it's not God's judgment on that community as much as, well, they live on an earthquake zone or fault, right? There's other reasons or other ways to understand it. So I'm going to stop there because that's really the end of this section, but mainly so we can talk about the balance of this, right? So any other thoughts on Sodom and Gomorrah, and certainly Abraham's bargaining, which I do agree with Brueggemann, calls it all into question. Nope, we got it all figured out, huh? Good. Good. All right. Well, good. Next week we'll do chapter 20. We'll jump in and continue marching through on all of this. We're I don't think I've not looked at 20. I'll have to look at that, but it's the balance of 19, the resettling of Lot and his family in the promised land, and then what starts happening with Ishmael and Isaac. I think we get back to that original nuclear family and what's happening with them. So it'll be good.
Be good.
All right, my friends. Well, have a great day. We'll see you soon, and hope to see you Sunday, if not before.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
We'll be
Bye,
there
y'all.
Sunday.
Oh, in person?
In person.
In person.
We're going to
Okay.
be there in person. Yes. We're leaving this afternoon and driving for Sandy Springs. Heading for Sandy
Okay.
Springs. Yeah, so we'll look for you at church Sunday.
I'll be
We're
there.
gonna go to Bill's Sunday school class and then to church.
I'll be there.
Good.
I'll be in the front in the long slimming black.
I know.
There you go.
You always, you're very faithful. And there's all the Sundays we watch at home when we can't be there. So, all right.
Well,
All
I
right,
will look
perfect.
for you two.
Take care, my friends. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.